A very warm welcome to all of you to the 4th C.R. Parekh Memorial Lecture, which is instituted by the Parekh Institute of Indian Thought at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies. Just briefly about the Institute. The Parekh Institute was set up in 2013 thanks to a very generous endowment by Bhikkhu Parekh and his brother, who wanted to institute something in memory of their father, C.R. Parekh. The mandate of the Institute is very clearly defined. What we need to do is to study the past and present political...
Mic is not working.
Oh, is it? Sorry. The past and present social, political and moral thought of India. The emphasis is on thought at the Institute. So what we do is to study the internal structure of ideas, the web of significances of these ideas, on linguistic usage and concepts, the entire structure of thought, the historically constituted conceptual world, and the social and political imaginaries of the period that we're studying. And we do all this in a rather, in our view, unusual way, because we select an appropriate theme for a year, and then we invite 3 internationally renowned scholars to come and join us for a period of anything up to 1 to 3 months, and we select certain texts on those themes, and we do an intensive study of those texts with scholars who are well versed in those texts and who know their languages very well, unlike us who don't. Sanskrit, Pali, Persian, and perhaps sometimes other Indian languages. So in 2015, we had a group of people, Patrick Oliver, Tim Lubin, and Mark McLeish, and we studied the Arthashastra, the Manatara Shastra. We had a look at the Ashokan inscriptions, and the theme that we chose in that time was religio-philosophical diversity and how the states handle them. So we looked at both the Dharmashastri and the Arthashastri tradition. In 2016, we had Ajay Rao, Chris Minkowski, and Larry McCrae. And the theme that was chosen was exclusion and marginality. And we had sections from the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. We did, we studied texts, the selected portions on Eklavya, on Shambhuka, the hunter and the Brahmin, Shabari, and we also did a Mimamsa text, a Shabara-bhashya. In 2017, we were very lucky that we got to collaborate with the Badruin Institute, and with their help, we were able to get not only, we had our own 3 scholars. Patrick returned, and then there was Donald Davis and Jean Schleiter, but there were 3 scholars who could come to India, all experts on ancient Chinese thought: David Wong, Lee Chen-yang, Roger Ames, and Daniel Bell. And we studied ancient Indian and ancient Chinese texts together over a period of 1 month, and the theme chosen on that occasion was the ends of human life, and we did a conference on that, and hopefully the proceedings of the conference will be published maybe later next year. And this year we have with us David Schulman, Yigal Bronner, Gary Tubb, Keshvan Nalutha, and Sudha Gopalakrishnan, and we've chosen certain Sanskrit texts. There are a number of them, but the one that we I'd like to mention is the Annexe, which is a critique of Kāvyādarśa. It's a very incisive, brilliant critique of Kāvyādarśa in the best sort of hermeneutical tradition. So you not only do you get a good judgment on the art form, but you also get a very good understanding of what it is. So the dictum that you've got to understand something before you criticize it, before you pass judgment on it, is exemplified in that text, and we went through that and several other texts. The three lectures, the first one, Parekh Memorial Lecture, was given by Parekh, the second by Chris Minkowski, the third by David Wong, and the fourth is given by Yigal Bronner, who's going to talk about Dandin's open mirror. I will now request Gary Tubb, who's a professor of Indian philosophy and Sanskrit at the University of Chicago, and who was also the faculty director of the University Chicago Center in Delhi until recently. I request him to please chair the talk today. Gary.
Introduced to you as tonight's speaker, an inspiring colleague of mine. First, I'd like to thank Rajiv Bhargava and the Parekh Institute for making possible the workshop that Rajiv just described, which gave a number of us a chance to have some wonderful sessions of reading Sanskrit text together with Rajiv and some of his colleagues at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies. So I also want to thank the CSDS generally for providing us a very nice setting for that enjoyable work. I'd also like to thank the CSDS more narrowly for finally providing me for the first time with a handy way through their own initials of summarizing some of the areas of expertise that tonight's speaker commands, which is such a broad field that I've never known how to address it in a short period of time. But now I know, because I think many of you who know Yigal Bronner will recognize that these are four of his areas of most prominent expertise, and I'll just name them very quickly, starting from the more mundane up to the more academic. So C is for coffee, as in how to brew a recognizable cup of real coffee. S is for soccer, that is the fine points of owning a share, however small, of a professional football team. D is Dandin, which is the topic of tonight's talk, and I'll return to that in a minute. And last but most importantly, S is, of course, Sanskrit. And in the field of Sanskrit studies, Yigal Bronner has been an influential and exciting scholar who has written and read, taught and talked on, again, a rather wide range of topics, but especially on poetry and poetics, and on the cultural history of India, with a focus especially on the deep south of India, but also with attention to areas such as Kashmir. Yigal Bronner, I'm proud to say, did his PhD at the University of Chicago in the Department of South Asian Languages and Civilizations. And once he had done that, he went on to teach for some years in Tel Aviv before returning to Chicago, where he taught for a number of wonderful years as assistant professor and eventually associate professor with tenure. And then more recently, for some reason, went back to the university where he did his BA, which is Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he is now an associate professor in the Department of Asian Studies. He's also currently the director of the Martin Buber Society of Fellows, which is also the research facilities are located at the Hebrew University, and they bring together scholars from many places working in many fields and disciplines to work together. He is also the founder and continuing guide of a remarkable project called Pandit.org, which is a prosopographical database of persons, places, texts relevant to Sanskrit studies. And this, I think, will, in due time, make a substantial difference in the work that we will be able to do. Yigal has written about these things in a number of books. One of them is based on his dissertation, Extreme Poetry, which focuses on the South Asian movement of simultaneous narration, texts that tell more than one story at the same time. But he's also written a number of other books, or co-edited other books done with other people, and including translations of Sanskrit poetry, studies in the history of South Asian texts, and the history of Sanskrit poetry and poetics. And he's written a large number of articles, chapters, entries, reviews, essays. One thing I'd like to mention before I turn things over to Yigal is what I see as a distinctive feature of his work that actually, in my mind, ties him rather closely to the character, so far as we can determine it, and Yigal has helped us a lot to determine it, the character of the author that he'll be talking about tonight, Dandin, and especially in terms of the topic that Yigal will apparently be emphasizing, which is the openness, in several senses, of Dandin's approach to poetics. And so in comparing Yigal Bronner to Dandin, I'll just speak very briefly about things as they're connected only to Dandin's work on poetics and not his own poetry and other things. And to begin with, superficially, there may be some similarity in terms of the name. The name Dandin, as far as I know, is a title. We don't know why the author Dandin was called that, whether it was because he held some government office or because he was some kind of renunciant ascetic. But we know, as several of his students in the room could tell you, that in Yigal's case, he's worthy of the title Dandin because of the way that he holds the danda in the sense of the rod of control, going all the way back to his first years of teaching first year Sanskrit using a textbook in Hebrew, where rumor has it he often on the first day of class would go up and down visiting each desk, not with a stick in his hand, but with scissors, which he would use to cut out from the back of each book the answers to the exercises. I think of him as a Dandin in that sense. But more seriously, I wanted to say just a word about the whole topic of openness. Yigal will explain what he means by that. But I wanted to mention a couple things about Yigal's own work, and actually, I guess, three areas of openness. The first one is already suggested by my telling you that he is the director of an important society of fellows, and that he has launched a collaborative database project that he has been involved throughout his career in organizing or participating in, or both, in workshops of the type that some of us have come here to Delhi for this month, and also by the fact that many of his publications are collaborative works. And that's that, as I suspect Yigal will tell you, Dandin's work on poetics had an unparalleled success in terms of being spread across Asia. In the same way, Yigal's work has been characterized from the beginning by his success in attracting collaboration with people from around the world, and also by facilitating in various ways an approach to Sanskrit studies that encourages and helps make possible cooperation between scholars from different countries. Second, although I don't know how much he'll be talking about it today in his own work on Dandin, Yigal has shown the extent to which Dandin applied principles of practicality and reason to his analysis of Sanskrit poetry. By that I mean that he was always careful to consider not simply what he might have received from tradition about categories of literary analysis, but by actually trying to find out what worked, what things are possible in poetry that make that poetry more enjoyable. And a third thing, which is connected with both of these, is openness in terms of an insistence on critical inquiry and a rational discussion in an atmosphere of freedom of expression and of a real interchange of ideas. And you can see that in the subsequent history of Dandin's work, in all of the translations, commentaries, and revisions. You can also see it in the workshops that Yigal has organized on the topic of Dandin and on many other topics as well. So I'm very happy that he's chosen this topic of openness. For two reasons really. One is that I like to think that some of Yigal's emphasis on open inquiry, on critical inquiry, free discussion of ideas and of evidence, and all of the principles of rigor and rational discourse and politeness that implies. I like to think that in some of this he was influenced by his years at my own university, the University of Chicago. And finally, I'm happy that he's chosen the topic because it seems to me, for reasons that I'm sure are obvious to many of you in the room, that this topic of openness to international cooperation, to free discussion of ideas, to critical inquiry in an atmosphere of evidence, rationality, civility. These are all topics that are of great concern in many different areas today, not least in the area of Sanskrit studies and of study of Indian culture and Indian intellectual history in general. So I think it's a timely topic. I think Yigal Bronner is the perfect person to tell you more about it and to help you think about these things, and also to share with you one of the most interesting and impressive products of the Indian cultural past, the mirror of literature of Dandin. So I now give you Professor Yigal Bronner.
Introduction, and to all of you for coming. Some of you may be wondering why you should be hearing a talk about what is today, at least, a relatively obscure Sanskrit text on poetics by a person named Dandin, who lived about 1300 years ago, most likely worked at the Pallava court in the southern city of Kanchipuram around the end of the 7th century. Well, one point of interest is that his mirror of literature, his Kāvyādarśa, is a text that had an extremely unusual career. It was translated and adapted into a variety of languages in the south: Kannada, Sinhala, Pali, Tamil. It traveled to Southeast Asia, so it traveled both sides, actually to both sides of the Bay of Bengal, and and Burma, and also further south to, it probably was in Thailand. There's reason to believe that it may have played some role in the creation of Old Javanese literature. It was translated into Tibetan and Mongolian, and it may have even traveled to China and Japan. And it also gained a large following within the Sanskrit tradition itself, where it survived in many manuscripts, attracted a sizable group of commentators very early on, and inspired thinkers as late as King Bhoja of Dhar in the 11th century and Appayya Dikshita in the 16th century. So, as Sheldon Pollock has argued, measured by the crudest quantitative standards, miles traveled, size of readership, kind of language traditions influenced, number of translations and adaptations and borrowings, Dandin's work can safely be adjudged the most important work on literary theory and practice in Asian history, and in world history, a close second to Aristotle's Poetics. And actually, with all due respect to my teacher, I would like to argue that maybe Aristotle's Poetics can be adjudged as a close second to Dandin's Mirror of Literature. In several respects that I can actually mention. First of all, continuity of reading this text. As some of you may know, Aristotle's Poetics was for a long time not known in most parts of Latin-speaking Europe, and was only reintroduced in the time of the Renaissance to Europe through the Arabic translation of it. And at that time, many of the works that Aristotle was referring to were little known by the readers of that work. In terms of its impact, really, Dandin's Mirror was a foundational work in many, or the adaptations of Dandin's Mirror were usually foundational in the cultures that translated or adapted the mirror. So, for example, in Kannada, the 9th century Kāvyādarśa Marg, an adaptation of Dandin's Mirror, is the first extant text that we have in that language. In Sri Lanka, a translation of Dandin's Mirror, Silbaslakara, Ornaments, Poetics in our own language, in Sinhala, is the foundational text on poetics in this long-standing tradition that is still lively today. In Tibet, the numerous translations and the mountain of commentaries on the Kāvyādarśa is really the foundation of belles lettres, of rhetoric, of poetics, of learned conversation. The same is true of Mongolia, and even in Tamil, which stands out in the sense that by the time that Dandin's text was translated into Tamil, around the 11th or 12th centuries, Tamil had a long-standing tradition, its own independent tradition of poetics and poetic creativity and text on poetics and so on. Nonetheless, the translation of Dandin was a big turning point in the aesthetic sensibilities of the creation of poetry and literature in Tamil. So it was a new foundational moment. And by the way, in each of these examples, Dandin was translated, and immediately the translation or adaptation usually created a kind of additional family, a whole gamut of additional text that constituted its family in this language. So this is really a huge impact. I mean, the Tibetan example, by the way, is outstanding. To this day, people in Tibetan high schools, kids in Tibetan high schools, memorize the Kāvyādarśa in Tibetan. And what they do, what they're asked to do, is to write notebooks of illustrations. That is, illustrations to Dandin's definition. So there's a huge library of these notebooks, and all the who's and who's in Tibetan history have read about or learned from adaptations or translations of the Mirror, or wrote commentaries. The fifth Dalai Lama wrote a commentary on Kāvyādarśa and so on and so forth. I don't want to belabor this point. Indeed, the impact of Dandin on the Sanskrit poetic tradition itself is usually vastly underestimated. And I'm happy to talk more about this. Even in the valley, afterwards if we have time, even in the valley of Kashmir, which later than Dandin, between the 9th and the 12th century, this area, this region of Kashmir, fashioned itself as the kind of the center of Sanskrit poetics and literary sensibilities, and where texts from the south were usually snubbed. Even there, the Mirror was widely read and well recognized. Indeed, the Sanskrit tradition is full of praises that indicate the importance of Dandin for those who are willing to listen. It is no coincidence, for example, that Dandin is anachronistically grouped with Kalidas and Bhavabhuti as one of the members of the small dream team supposedly assembled in Bhoja's legendary court. Or listen to this verse. Jate jagati valmikau shabdaka viriti stita vyase jate kavicheti kāvyādarśa dandini. When Valmiki was born, the word poet was coined. After Vyasa, you could say it in the duo, and poets, in the plural, first appeared along with Dandin. Valmiki is the composer, as you all know, of the first poem, the Ramayana. The second poem, the Mahabharata, is famously attributed to Vyasa. So primordial are these authors and their epic works that with them the word kavi, poet, was originally uttered, first only in the singular and then in the dual. But it was only with Dandin that the category became popular, as manifested linguistically by its use in the plural. It was Dandin who opened the gates of poetry, so far associated with its exclusive pair of founding fathers. And one could take this verse, as I would like to take it, as a comment, among other things, on the vast success of the Mirror of Literature, the Kāvyādarśa, a book that introduced readers throughout Asia to the art of poesy. So, how to explain this phenomenon, right? The huge success of Dandin's Mirror in South Asia and beyond. After all, there are, even if we accept as granted the importance of Sanskrit in this vast world, there are many other texts on the shelf of Sanskrit poetics, Alankara Shastra, many of which texts are far better known today. Was it just sheer luck? For example, the map that I described to you, that map has a predominance for the Buddhist roots and the Buddhist communities. Sri Lanka, Burma, Tibet, Mongolia, we can see that. So maybe we know that Dandin's text was studied in Buddhist universities, Buddhist centers of learning, temples, courts, and so on. So maybe I can imagine a scenario. Maybe one monk once left for a journey, packed all these manuscripts in his bag. Just as he was about to leave for his journey, let's take another book, and he by chance grabbed the Kāvyādarśa, put it in his backpack, and the rest is history. Maybe it was just sheer luck. I don't think so. Great books that made history, books that made Asia, certainly had luck, but they must have also have had a special appeal that should partly explain their vast success, their lasting success. And in what follows, I would like to suggest one reason, one among many reasons, by the way. This talk comes out of a work of a group that has been sitting together for half a year, 2 years ago, at the Institute of Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, the Israeli Institute of Advanced Studies, Some of the members of this group are sitting in this room, and we are bringing together a volume dedicated to the mirror, Dandin's mirror, in many of these literary cultures and in Sanskrit. And again, some of the contributors of that volume are sitting in this room. They have other explanations, other things to say. I just want to concentrate on one among many reasons that I think contributed to the mirror's great success, and I would like to argue that its ability to open so many new paths was related to a unique openness that this work embodied and that its readers identified in it. And when I speak about openness, you will see that I will veer from the pedagogical to the theoretical to the social. So openness in more than one respect. So one of the, and when we speak of openness, we have to put this lack of openness in the context. And I say that because one of the defining characteristics of Sanskrit theoretical discourse, Shastra, is, as Sheldon Pollock has convincingly shown, its avowed ideology of knowledge as a closed set. This view harks back to the understanding of the revelation of the Veda, the paradigm of true knowledge in the Brahminical world, as eternal, immutable, and transcending human agency. All that mortals can do, according to this ideology, is partly reproduce knowledge. Now, I'm not saying that this ideology represents the practice of theory. Practice of theory in South Asia always brimmed with immense innovation and originality. That's not what I'm saying. All I'm saying is that authors of cultural grammars on nearly every topic almost unanimously subscribe to a meta-theory of what they're doing, according to which knowledge systems were fixed. Now, Sanskrit poetics, the theory of poetry, the theory of literature, was an exception in being empirically oriented from the start. And the openly empiricist agenda of Dandin's main predecessor, Bhāmaha, is an early example of this trend. But Dandin's approach, I would argue, in his mirror, is entirely unprecedented. No other Sanskrit scholar writing in any field, no earlier authority on literature, certainly not the deliberately conservative Bhāmaha, ever breathed such an air of openness. What do I mean by that? For one thing, for Dandin, every category is deliberately celebrated as unbounded. There are numerous examples of this approach. Take, for instance, his presentation of poetic ornaments, alankaras, or figures of speech, which are the main topic of his book. They are the topic of his main and second chapter out of 3, and the longest chapter in his book. And Dandin says that he begins, in fact, he frames the whole chapter by saying that ornaments, figures of speech, cannot be presented in toto because, and I quote, they continue to be coined even as we speak. So, and he brings the chapter to conclusion. So the other frame, the other end, the other bookend of this chapter, 365 verses later, by saying that the preceding discussion was only a brief foray into a vast field that is boundless. Okay, so it's interesting to see that already in this frame, the notion of unboundedness is partly theoretical. There's an infinite number of permutations and inventions of figurative language, and partly historical. There is a history to this, ongoing history to this tradition of literature. Poets are born every day, every new day there are new poets. They invent new things, so there is openness in terms of the historical and futuristic outlook of this tradition. So this is framing, these two statements frame the main chapter of this book, the longest and most important chapter of the book. And within this chapter, very similar statements frame the introduction of every single ornament almost. So let me give you just one example. The discussion of the simile, this most important and quintessential alankara for Dandin, begins by stating that it has a vast universe, and ends by, after discussing its sibling alankara, rupaka, identification, by the way, in unprecedented detail, it ends by noting that there is no end to the categories of simile and identification. And the chapter is just replete with such language, so I won't belabor the point with more additional examples, so I can supply them. So this is about figures of speech, but Dandin's bold vision of openness and repeated statements of this sort is also true of every other topic in the mirror. From poetic paths, margas, which he says, and listen carefully, are as numerous as our poets, to the types and subtypes of rhyming devices, again, said to be innumerable. Indeed, elasticity is also, well, now we're turning to some other angle on openness, elasticity. Elasticity is also written into the definition of many of these devices. So, I'll give you a few examples. Simile is said to be a commonality between entities that is understood in whatever manner. Alliteration is defined as similarity of sound that is expressed in whichever way. The virtue, guna, magnificent, udara, consists of the portrayal of any good quality, and powerful poetry, ojas, is said to be multiform. So, in addition to a vision of poetic devices of different orders and different kinds as being boundless, Dandin's openness also means that every no is a strong yes in disguise. And this is especially true in the case of Bhamaha's no's. There are definitely yeses. So, where I'll give you a few examples. Sorry, forgot this. So, Bhama viewed factual statements, swabhavuktis, and various types of other ornaments such as causation, hetu, sukshma, and lesha. Bhama views them as prosaic. But Dandin said, no, they're the number one ornament and first-rate ornaments, respectively. Bhama thought that riddles, which are just ridiculous, they're so difficult to the point of unintelligibility, at least if you don't have a running commentary with you. And Dandin responded by saying, no, riddles are kind of fun to use in the company of connoisseurs. What about unconventional plot structures? To Bhama's horror, in some works, the antagonist is first valorized and is later slain. But Dandin said that these kind of plot structures are just as good as the standard one, in which the protagonist is first valorized, because I like them too. More generally, Dandin's discussion, so these are no's, these are don'ts taken from Bhamaha that Dandin turns into do's, okay? But this is a more general principle. I mean, he clearly has something ongoing with Bhama, but this is a more general principle for Dandin. His discussion of poetic flaws, of doshas, this is an important topic in Sanskrit poetics, dwells not on the liabilities in and of themselves, but on the way each liability is an asset, guna, waiting to be realized. So, again, I don't have the time to give you too many examples, but I'll give you an example relating to a subset of these gunas that are called the simile, the subset of these doshas, these flaws that are called the simile flaws. All kinds of things that can go wrong in a simile. Like, for example, if there is discrepancy in terms of gender and case and number between the standard and the subject of a simile, that's a flaw, and that's been discussed earlier by people such as Bama. Now, Dandin also discusses these things, but instead of simply reproducing the age-old warnings about faulty similes, Dandin frames his very conversation on this topic by stating that these so-called deficiencies are, if used thoughtfully, are not deficiencies at all. Okay, so if you can do something with the doshas to turn them into gunas. I'll come back to that at the end of my talk, which is not too far away, so don't worry. A different version of this open approach, and here we turn to more social questions, beginning to turn into more social questions, is found when Dandin touches on the all-important category poet. Who can be a poet? It's a good question, right? What makes a true poet, he asserts, possibly following an earlier list of factors, are inborn insight, impeccable long education, and unwavering hard work. Now, the implication of item number 1 on this list is that the literary path is determined by one's birth, and that being born with the right gift is a necessary, albeit not sufficient, condition for poetic success. But Dandin hastens to add, and this is very important, that even if one lacks insight resulting from past good deeds, one can still win the grace of speech, Vak, merely by education and hard work. So the category of poet, too, is open if only the candidate is receptive to instruction and willing to try. And I believe that all the lists that Dandin presents as closed, they have an X number of items, come with caveats that render them at least partially open. And consider in this connection the crucial question of the languages in which literature can be composed. Like Bama before him, Dandin allows only the cosmopolitan idioms, the languages of the way, the right to poetic expressivity. No local idiom, no language of the place, is given in his short list, which consists of 4 items: Sanskrit, Prakrit, Appayya, and a mixture thereof, which in and of itself is kind of an interesting innovation. It wasn't in Bama's list. So, Dandin lived in Kanchipuram. People who were around him were speaking, singing, composing works in Tamil. The word Tamil does not appear in this list and nowhere else in the Kāvyādarśa. So, a closed set of languages. But it immediately becomes clear that the list is more inclusive than it seems. This is because Prakrit itself, we have here in the room the world's topmost expert on Prakrit, Andrew Wallet, so his book just came out on the language of the snakes. Maybe we will hear his opinion on this. But Prakrit is immediately opened up, and it, like all the previous categories that I mentioned so far, is presented as a multifaceted category, Annexe Prakrita Kramaha, whose vocabulary, it is said, is derived not only from Sanskrit loanwords and cognates, but also from the languages of the place. Prakrit is then explicitly said to be in dialogue with literatures from a variety of ethnic and linguistic communities, and a list of languages and dialects is suddenly provided: Maharashtri, Sauraseni, Gaudi, Lati, and other like them, Anyacha, Tadrishi. So this list too is incomplete and in that sense open. Moreover, when Dandin's next task is to plot the question of genre and language, so there are specific languages used for some genres and not others, and so on. So he plots these 2 grids on onto the other. And it turns out that actually some genres can migrate from one language or one linguistic medium to another, and we suddenly hear we suddenly hear that all languages, listen to this term, sarva bhasha bhihi, all languages. So bhasha here is a very loaded term. This is not a cosmopolitan language. All languages, as well as Sanskrit, can produce various narrative literature, katha adi. And finally, another language on which Andrew is also an expert, the so-called ghost language, or Paishachi, is introduced as the medium of the Brihat Katha, the amazing great story, a work that is now lost. So, although it is true that Dandin stops short of licensing specific vernaculars as literary open, and this surprising approach was instrumental in applying the mirror to literary languages originally outside of its official scope. So, I'll give you just one example. When Tibetan commentators were writing commentaries on the Kāvyādarśa's translation into Tibetan, they were trying to figure out where Tibetan fits into this seemingly closed club of languages, but they have many options. Some said that Tibetan was Appayya, others said that Tibetan was Paishachi, but many of them said that Tibetan was one or the other category of this multifaceted Prakrit. So we can see how this, what I see as a half-stated invitation from Dandin for the authors in other languages to enter the club was actually taken by some of these authors. In short, Dandin produced a kind of a literary grammar wherein every rule also contains the seed of self-transcendence, something that David Shulman believes is emblematic of South Indian grammars. And indeed, note Dandin's remarkable open approach to the extremely influential discourse of grammar proper, of Vyakarana, Shabda. For one thing, Dandin differed from his predecessors and successors by freely veering into areas uncharted by Pani. For another, he was explicit about his approach when he said, boldly and in stark contrast to Vamaha, whom you can see here, that non-grammatical forms, you will have to trust me, I'll run through this shortly, he said that non-grammatical forms can be used in poetry if they are patterned on the precedents set by trustworthy writers, who for him are the authority. What they used, shishta ishta, is the gold standard. In stark contrast to what Obama has said, using very similar words. More generally, on the topic of grammar, and grammar was an extremely important topic in the grammar books traveled along with poetry books, along with poetic books. It was constitutive of the Sanskrit cosmopolis, as Parekh has written about. We know that one's grammar of choice, and here we come back to the social question, we know that one's grammar of choice often marked one's religious or regional identity, and that certain grammars were preferred in Brahmin circles, while others were preferred in Buddhist and Jain communities. And again, Dandin's policy here is illuminating. Whereas Bhamaha and many of his later followers from Kashmir swore exclusive alliance to this triumvirate of Panini, Katyayana, and Patanjali, Dandin is audibly silent on this point and never mentions his preferred grammar, and thereby suggesting, especially to the many readers who studied his work along with Bhama, and I can prove that there were many such readers, thereby suggesting to these careful readers that he was open to the use of linguistic treatises prevalent in non-Brahmin communities. And indeed we know that non-Paninian grammars often accompanied the mirror as it traveled through Asia. Now, there are other indications that despite Dandin's Brahmin identity, he was a Shaiva, the mirror was crafted so as not to offend the sensibilities of other religious communities. For instance, Dandin was careful not to repeat Bama's attack on the Buddhist theory of apoha, an attack which was not well received in Buddhist circles. Although I doubt very much that he subscribed to it. So if this was a point that people following Bama had to take a stand on, Dandin abstained. And moreover, I argue that Dandin was actually actively trying to cater to poets belonging to the Buddhist community, which at the time that he composed his work in Kanchipuram was a very dominant and culturally important community in the south. And I base this argument not just on the silences just demonstrated about grammar, about apoha, and so on, and not just on the general openness that I was arguing for, but also on a passage so far mostly overlooked, and I believe totally misunderstood, in Dandin's discussion of flaws, of doshas. The dosha is specifically the dosha of contradiction, virodha. And so here I will actually delve into the text very briefly, and it will be somewhat slightly technical, but it will be short and hopefully not too technical. So, what is the flaw of a contradiction? Poetic statements are considered flawed if they contradict, among many other things that they can contradict, the scripture, agama, or logic or policy, nyaya. Okay? So you don't want your poem, you don't want your book to have something that contradicts agama or that contradicts nyaya. Okay? That's what Bama said, and he defined both of these categories in strictly Brahminical terms. He said that scriptures, agama, refer to Hindu Dharma literature and the limits that it sets, and logic to similar treatises but more of political theory in nature. So he gives two examples. The first example is of a King Vatsa, who was politically savvy as portrayed in a work of literature, but he failed to employ spies, charas, and that's a flaw of the poet. If the poet tells us that the king was a good king, but he didn't send spies, that's a bad thing in the poem, okay? Because it contradicts good policy. And likewise, if we have a passage telling us about a prince who untimely intervened, although his father is still alive, his education, or samskara, remember that term, is not yet complete, and he is not yet married, he rushes to kill an enemy at night. And I don't know what the story is, I must confess. It's somewhat obscure to me. But it is clear that by thus acting, the prince overstepped the boundaries of Brahminical legal tradition. And by portraying him doing that, the poet overstepped the flaw of contradiction of Nyaya. Okay? So far so good? Now, from the many types of such contradictions, Dandin turns the aforementioned subtypes of contradiction of agama and contradiction of nyaya into a tight pair. The contradiction of agama remains purely Brahminical, whereas nyaya is identified with logic more broadly, much more broadly defined, and indeed the examples are coupled along religious lines. And we see that the category of contradicting logic is expanded to include Buddhist teachings. So, let's do that. The Buddha spoke the truth. Impressions, samskara, are eternal. Hence, that girl with chakora eyes forever remains in my heart. That's the first example. The second example, although a novice, he's got a guru to teach him the Vedas. A diamond naturally pure needs no polish, samskara. Now, these examples of contradiction with logic and contradiction with scripture, respectively, are twinned by the use of the pregnant word samskara, as you can see initiation, education, polish, acculturation, which already appeared in Bhama's example of one of the latter. Moreover, although actually these are pretty nice verses, quite elegant, each verse grossly misinterprets one religious message. Yeah? Buddhism teaches not the permanence of mental impressions, but rather their impermanence. And Brahmins do not allow non-initiates access to the Vedas. Okay? These misrepresentations, moreover, that's key. They're not intended. They're not intended. Dandin tells us that. Okay? They are by definition the result of neglect. Kāvyādarśa pramadat. Okay? So it's not as if the poet wanted to poke fun of Buddhist poetry or of Buddhist tenets or of Brahmin tenets. They just forgot Buddhism 101 and Dharma Shastra 101 and composed these poems. Okay? That's what renders these poems flawed. Now, all of this is powerful, of course, for Dandin, but the fact that he fashions the former category so as to take Buddhist and not just Brahminical teaching into account is what I find striking. He seems to operate under the assumption that his theory and pedagogy are meant for and open to poets of religions and communities other than his own. So before I come to a kind of a conclusion of this talk, I just want to show you that these doshas, these contradictory flaws, these viroda doshas of agama and nyaya, which are fatal for Bhama, are redeemable for Dandin as well. So these two are examples of things that if you do consciously, if you do playfully, if you know what you're doing, but not doshas at all, but actually gunas. So let me give you the two examples. Okay? Here is one. And that is to say, if you're using him with kavi kaushalya and not kavehe pramada. Okay? So here's one. I reckon you, you're beyond reckoning. You are whole, but you have no parts. You're one, you're legion, you're everything. Okay? And the second one, the lady of Panchala, Draupadi, wife to 5 Pandu sons, was the best of women. A person's destiny is destined to be. So the first of these verses, once again, finds a contradictory religious message. But this time, the inconsistency is true to the infinitely paradoxical nature of the divine. In other words, the contradiction inheres in the doctrine as seen through emic eyes. And the poet highlights this flaw and turns it into the centerpiece of the short poem consciously, reflexively. Okay? Note, by the way, that the verse does not identify its addressee. Who is this divinity the poet is talking to? In theory, it could be a divinity of any denomination. The second example, likewise, in the second example, the contradiction between Draupadi's being married to 5 men, we just read a text about this in our group at the CSDS, and Alayani Charitra Prabandha. The fact that, and that has troubled many people, with many voices within the Sanskrit tradition and other South Asian traditions, the fact that the contradiction between Draupadi's being married to 5 men and her role as a paragon woman is the very topic of poetic contemplation and the source of the charm of the verse, rather than the result of some oversight or neglect of the poem. Moreover, this short poem may be read as a statement about the aesthetic principle at hand. In poetry, just as in Dharma, a seeming wrong can actually be right. Options are plural, and one always has to keep one's eyes open to hidden plans and explanations. So I come to the concluding part of my short talk. It is perhaps no coincidence that of the 3 earliest commentators on Dandin's mirror, on Dandin's Kāvyādarśa, one was a Buddhist monk, Ratnashri Jnana. The other was likely a Jain, Vadi Chandaladeva. And the third, a Brahmin, Taruna Vachaspati. Indeed, the vast success of the mirror throughout the expanding network of Buddhist centers of learning is also clearly not an accident. Dandin's openness helped him speak in a truly cosmopolitan voice, and his mirror was adopted in and thus helped create a truly vast cosmopolis. My argument then is that with unbound categories celebrated as such, a principle that every rule can be transcended, a cosmopolitan and tolerant worldview, and an appeal to a variety of communities, regional, religious, and linguistic, the mirror was unabashedly open and openly received. So when writers in fields other than poetics looked for a rare quote about the inherently open-ended nature of knowledge, Dandin was a natural choice. I'll give you one example before I conclude. Take for example, the great 10th century polymath Vachaspati Mishra in his sub-commentary on the Brahma Sutras. He is trying to corroborate here in this passage Shankara's claim that Brahma's composition of the vast Veda, that's what Shankara claimed, is proof of Brahma's omniscience. Okay? How do we know that? He says, well, nowadays too, says Vachaspati Mishra, when I and other authors, compose treatises about comprehensive topics, we know more than we actually say. We all know this when we write. We can't say everything we know, right? So even if you realize a whole gamut of special facets, there's simply no way you can spell them all out. After all, even Goddess Saraswati, he adds in a close paraphrases of Dandin, cannot describe all the different types of sweetness, of sugarcane, milk, sugar, and so on. And yes, Dandin originally left even this list open. So this is my argument. One, that the mirror was a text with a uniquely open vision. Two, that thinkers within and outside the Sanskrit world were conscious of this aspect of the text. And three, that this openness contributed to the open welcome it received in large parts of Asia. You can ask me, however, whether the mirror was not too open. After all, who needs a text upon poetics if it tells you, as you could construe the mirror to say, that anything goes? Isn't the whole point of borrowing or adapting or translating a text on poetics that you would have the prestige of having an authoritative set of do's and especially don'ts, rules that you cannot break? But the answer to these questions, the way I think Dandin avoids the risks of too much openness, are a topic for another talk. So I want to thank the CSDS and Rajiv Bhargava, the Parekh Institute, and also the honor of being the fourth speaker in such an illustrious list of speakers in the Parekh Memorial Talks. And you, and I can stop here and take a few questions if there's time. Thank you so much.